Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm Emily Parsons, Deputy Director and Curator for the American Revolution Institute of the Society of the Cincinnati. Delighted to welcome you all to today's Lunch Bite. The American Revolution Institute promotes knowledge and appreciation for the achievement of American independence by supporting advanced study, developing changing exhibitions, presenting historical programs like these, as well as tours of our historic headquarters, advocating for historic preservation, and providing resources to classrooms nationwide that benefit teachers, students, and scholars alike. Today's Lunch Bite features Andrew Outten discussing a map created by Lafayette's aide-de-camp for King Louis XVI in 1779. And this map is featured in our current exhibition, Fête Lafayette, which marks the 200th anniversary of Lafayette's farewell tour of the United States. Andrew is the Institute's Historical Programs Manager, having joined our staff in 2021. Prior to that, he spent 9 years as Director of Education and Museum Services for the Brandywine Battlefield Park Associates. Here at the Institute, Andrew develops our historical programs ranging from lunch bites and lectures like these to battlefield tours and other special programs. Before I turn things over to Andrew, I want to go over a few housekeeping things for our friends joining us on Zoom. Following the lunch bite, there will be a question and answer session. Please feel free to submit your questions for Andrew at any point during the program by using the Q&A function that can be found at the bottom of your screen. We will do our best to incorporate your questions with those submitted by our live audience. Should you have any technical related questions or comments, those can be submitted by the chat function, and one of our staff members will be monitoring and do the best to assist you. Now, without further delay, please join me in welcoming Andrew Outten.
Thank you, Emily, and thank you, everyone, both here and abroad, for tuning in with us today. Not only am I generally excited to speak, but I'm even more excited about the fact that I get to speak about a significant map from our collections. And as my colleagues know, I do love a good map, but who doesn't? The contemporary maps from the American Revolution, they're a vital tool in helping us understand the conflict. Not only do they help us, the modern viewer, visualize the events that occurred, they were also essential to those living at the time of the war, from civilians to military officers and kings and queens alike. There are many well-known engineers and cartographers who worked to create such maps, but one of the most important and lesser-known engineers and map makers of the war was the French officer Michel Capitaine du Chesnoy, who came to America and helped support the American cause of independence with the Marquis de Lafayette in 1777. Capitaine's role was essential. Not only was he a map maker, but he also was a vital component when it came to the diplomatic relationship between France and the United States during the war. So with that, today's Lunch Bite will shed light on this understudied French military engineer by focusing on one of his most important maps that helped tip the balance of the American Revolution in America's favor. Now, unfortunately, there isn't much information available about the early life of Capitaine, nor are there any portraits or pictures of him, or else I would have included that. But prior to coming to America with Lafayette, Capitaine had served as a captain, and that's not to be confused with his name, in the French Army's Royal Corps of Engineers. And this was a corps whose engineers were notorious for their excellent training and skills when it came to military cartography. Capitaine's maps were not only a result of excellent training that he obtained from the Royal Corps of Engineers, but they were quite different, as his were always produced in a finished form. When it came to most 18th century military engineers and map makers, particularly in the British Army, their maps were produced in several phases that stemmed from preliminary rough sketches and compiled accounts from the battlefield. His were extremely detailed and insightful, so much that George Washington even praised Capitaine's maps in a letter by writing that they were executed with great accuracy and military intelligence, and they have a special place among the papers which I set value. Capitaine's role in coming to America was very specific. He was to capture and depict the experiences of Lafayette and the fledgling Continental Army. And with that, each of his maps served a specific purpose. To date, there are only 6 of his maps known to be preserved in American libraries. So we all know how this guy came to America, the Marquis de Lafayette. How he went against the king's wishes, King Louis XVI, purchased his own ship, hired his own crew, and together with several other French officers sailed for America on La Victoire. And after landing near Charleston, South Carolina, how he traveled north to Philadelphia with a letter of recommendation that was provided by Benjamin Franklin, waiving this letter of recommendation in front of the Congress and offering his services up pro bono, and shortly after receiving his initial commission as a, quote, honorary, end quote, major general in the Continental Army. Unfortunately, Capitaine couldn't accompany Lafayette on his expedition to Philadelphia, as he became seriously ill almost immediately upon landing in South Carolina. This illness would significantly impact his initial time in America for nearly a year, and he would be forced to recover in North Carolina until April 1778. But notwithstanding his illness, Capitaine wasted no time in initiating the tasks he was charged with. While he was recovering in North Carolina, he produced his first map of the American Revolution, and this is depicting British General John Burgoyne and his army's capture of Ticonderoga in July of 1777, shortly before its monumental surrender several months later. As Capitaine was not present for the fort's capture, he relied on several American accounts to complete the map. This would be the only map of his throughout the American Revolution to be produced from secondhand sources, as the rest of his maps were produced according to his own firsthand experience. Following his recovery, Capitaine finally made it north to the Central Theater of War in April, again, 1778, and he soon after received a commission as a captain in the Continental Army's Corps of Engineers. He did not immediately link up with Lafayette, however, after receiving this commission. Instead, the American Congress gave him the mundane task of mapping the Susquehanna River, something that a protective and possessive Lafayette was entirely displeased with, to say the least. Capitaine came to America for a reason, and it wasn't to map the Susquehanna River. Lafayette wanted his trusty engineer by his side always. This was evident in a letter to Henry Lawrence, the president of the Congress, where Lafayette informed Lawrence that he was glad Capitaine was employed if no other can do the business, but he also reminded Lawrence that Capitaine should be considered as mine. Soon after this letter, Capitaine finally rejoined Lafayette at Baron Hill near Philadelphia, where Lafayette commanded a force of approximately 2,000 men and found himself in a precarious situation. After being pressed and nearly overrun by a larger British force of nearly 5,000 men under the command of British General Charles Grey, Lafayette barely escaped. Finally able to do what he initially was employed to do for Lafayette, Capitaine depicted Lafayette's bold retreat in this map right here. This is the plan of the retreat of Baron Hill in Pennsylvania. I'm not even going to try it in French. You wouldn't forgive me. But this highlights Lafayette's masterful escape from the impending danger of an enemy that outnumbered him 2-1. The map also shows that Capitaine paid particular attention to detail, because you can see the way that the American positions and the British positions are depicted. The British their assault on Baron Hill and other key topographical features and landmarks are very clear and very vibrant here. And again, this is all in finished form. So Capitaine continued to accompany Lafayette wherever they went for the remainder of 1778. Following the Battle of Monmouth in June of 78, Capitaine produced this manuscript map of the battle. Like his map of Baron Hill, Capitaine's map of Monmouth also included very detailed features. The details of this map, along with its thorough legend, helped to highlight Lafayette and the Continental Army's performance during the battle, which occurred shortly after the Franco-American alliance was signed. Other maps that Capitaine produced throughout the war included 2 maps depicting the 1778 actions in Rhode Island, where the French were obviously heavily involved. And in another letter written to Henry Lawrence in July of 1778, Lafayette finally explained Capitaine's true purpose and importance, when he wrote that Capitaine was such an officer I cannot spare, and I will employ him to make plans of our position and battle for Washington for me and also the king. And he's referring to King Louis XVI, who will be glad to have an exact draft of Washington's battles. This employment soon came to fruition as the war experienced a lull towards the end of 1778, and Lafayette requested leave to return to France, where he could further assist the American cause abroad by petitioning for additional French aid at Versailles. Lafayette was granted permission and brought along Capitaine, who in turn brought his maps. So Lafayette, when he returned to Paris in January 1779, things were not looking good. Things looked rather bleak when it came to the potential French aid in North America. French military interests were really focused on a joint Franco-Spanish invasion of England, not really sending troops or from the French army or ships from the French Navy. That was not a priority. As we could probably discuss that failed invasion in its own presentation, the short answer is it obviously never happened. And when all that fell apart, Lafayette really began to push his case for American support. Things continued to look bleak for Lafayette as his case when news of the failed Franco-American siege of Savannah arrived at Versailles. But yet he was still determined to secure that precious military aid and other vital resources for the American cause. Continued his quest, and he received a little help from the American ambassador to France, Benjamin Franklin, to do this. So from late 1779 and into 1780, Lafayette wrote several assertive and detailed letters to people like the Comte de Vergennes, who was pictured on the right here, who was the French foreign minister, and the French prime minister, the Comte de Maurepas. To both, he lobbied for French military aid for the Americans. And by reading his incessant letters, you can almost picture the looks on these two French officials' face when another letter would come in from Lafayette after they arrived. And if you've seen the new miniseries Franklin on Apple, there is a good, you're seeing Lafayette from a perspective early on, and how these guys are just getting annoyed by Lafayette's determination to come over to America. Lafayette, in one of his letters, warned Maurepas that if our clocks are slow, we shall see the operation fail for lack of diligence or of time. So Lafayette was pressed, he was on a mission, and he would see this mission through. Lafayette must have been elated on March 5th, 1780, when he received a special letter with instructions from the Comte de Vergennes that were issued by King Louis XVI. The first lines of the instruction read, Marquis de Lafayette, going to America, will hasten to join General Washington. He will inform him confidently that the king, wishing to give the United States new testimony of his affection and his concern for their security, has resolved to send to their aid 6 ships of the line and 6,000 regular infantry at the onset of spring. Through his persistence, Lafayette accomplished his mission, and a French army under the command of Comte de Rochambeau would soon depart for America. Now, through all of his lobbying efforts, one of Lafayette's most vital tools was that trusty engineer and mapmaker, Capitaine. For Lafayette knew that if the king had any interest in supporting the war, he would have to understand it. And what better way to understand something than to visualize it? After his arrival in Paris in January of 1779, Capitaine got right to work and started to produce the most important map out of all of the maps he produced depicting the American Revolution, which is obviously the feature of today's discussion. This map that you see on the screen is housed in our library collections, and as Emily mentioned, is currently featured in our current exhibition, Fête Lafayette, a French Hero's Tour of the American Republic. It is appropriately titled Map of the Theater of War in North America during the years 1775, 76, 77, 78. At 29.5 inches by 25.5 inches, the map is significantly large, and it offers a comprehensive view of the war from 1775 through 78, spanning from portions of Canada and the northern section of the United States down to the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay, where the major theater of war was. To denote the major events or battles, you have crossed swords signifying their locations throughout that vast landscape. To produce this map, Capitaine used a compilation of various maps and topographical features and other sources, making it different from his other maps, but obviously he's going to need that help to make something like this. Now, to offer the monarch additional insight, Capitaine included a chronology, which is probably the best feature of the large map. And this is going to include specific details about each event that Capitaine is depicting through those crossed swords and letters spread throughout the map. As Capitaine's maps were meant, again, to serve a purpose, the chronology begins with the Boston Massacre, which is incorrectly listed as as taking place on March 15th, 1775. So he's about 5 years off there. But this is important because the way he describes the Boston Massacre is a riot in Boston where the English Guard fired on inhabitants and killed several. So a little dramatic, but he needed to get that point across. This map was supposed to serve a purpose. Again, Boston Massacre's date is off, but this is going to be a significant start to the chronology. After the Boston Massacre listing, the campaigns of 1775 and 76 begin and include the Battle of Lexington. Concord is not included, most notably here. The Battle of Bunker Hill, the British evacuation of Boston, British General Howe's capture of New York, the battles of Long Island, White Plains, and Washington's success at Trenton. For 1777, Capitaine broke the events of that year into two sections. The events that occurred within the Philadelphia campaign and the Northern campaign, which is also known as the Saratoga campaign. What's odd is the fact that Capitaine didn't begin this 1777 section for the southern portion with Washington's victory at Princeton, which we all know is a monumental victory immediately after Trenton. In fact, there's no mention of it at all in the chronology or the map itself. Instead, he begins 1777 with Howe's disembarkation at the head of Elk in Maryland, where he began to push to Philadelphia. This was followed by other events throughout the Philadelphia campaign, including the Battle of Couch's Bridge, Brandywine, Germantown, and Gloucester, along with the Continental Army's encampments at White Marsh and Valley Forge to finish out the year. For the Northern or Saratoga campaign of 77, Capitaine included the British capture of Ticonderoga, the American victories at Fort Stanwix and Bennington, and finally, American General Gates' victory at Saratoga, where Burgoyne, for the first time in history, surrendered an entire British field army. Now, for 1778, the chronology begins with Lafayette's bold retreat at Barron Hill and is followed by the British evacuation of Philadelphia before mention of the Battle of Monmouth. But after this, he begins to offer heavy details about the movements of the Comte d'Estaing and the initial French expeditionary force, which includes their arrival, his entrance to arrival in Rhode Island, his entrance to the Rive de Providence, the landing of American troops in Rhode Island, and the arrival of the British fleet, the departure of the French fleet following that of Admiral Howe, and the return of the French fleet before they went to Boston. And finally, the failed Franco-American initiative at Newport and the evacuation of Rhode Island and the French fleet's withdrawal. Again, he needed to keep the French king informed of the French movements, and that is why you have such great detail dedicated to that portion of 1778. Now, it is unknown whether Capitaine's map was the actual tipping point for King Louis and his ministers, but it certainly had some influence, and it helped to accomplish the mission it was produced for. Today, all the known maps produced by Capitaine are in manuscript form, which adds to the rarity. The original 1779 map that was produced for the king was also in manuscript form. This map, however, that's in our collections, was the only map drawn by Capitaine to be reproduced, an obvious nod to its significance and influence. The map in our collections is, again, a printed version that was engraved under the direction of French cartographer Jean-Baptiste Fortin. This map was printed and sold in Paris beginning in 1780, around the time of Rochambeau's army's departure for America. When Lafayette triumphantly returned to America to deliver the good news he was provided by the Comte de Vergennes, Capitaine accompanied the marquis once again. He continued to serve throughout the Revolution as Lafayette's aide-de-camp, and he participated in Lafayette's campaign throughout Virginia, which Capitaine skillfully depicted in this map, one of his last maps of the American Revolution. He witnessed or participated in the siege of Yorktown, and he witnessed British General Charles Cornwallis's surrender to the Franco-American force, something that probably never would have happened had it not been for his 1779 map. Capitaine accompanied Lafayette back to France and retained his rank, by that time it was major, in the Continental Army until November of 1783. He was also an original member of the Society of the Cincinnati. He remained in the French Army, serving on its general staff until 1790, before passing away in 1804. Out of the countless maps produced by the American, British, French, and German map makers throughout the American Revolution, none are more significant to the American victory or the birth of the United States than this map right here. On this day, the 249th anniversary of the battles of Lexington and Concord, where the war really began, it's only appropriate to bring things full circle by discussing and highlighting this map that helped to bring an end to it, such an influence in bringing an end to it. For without this map, the Continental Army may have never secured that vital military aid from France in the form of Rochambeau's army that came from it. And without that, the war's outcome may have very well been different. So if you'd like to see this map, we don't have it on view here on the table, but I'd be happy to take you up. It's on display in the exhibition room, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that you may have about it. No? All right. All right. Well, thanks very much, everybody. We'll see you all next time.